Hello, all, and welcome back to another episode of Movies and Us, a weekly gathering place filled with conversations about movies, stories, and connection. My name is Jennifer Hahn.
And I'm Sarah Callan.
And today we're going to be reviewing the film Ghostlight, and we are joined by a very special guest, Michael. Michael, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Michael Burgett. I am the host of the Screen Nerds podcast, a film podcast for film lovers, by film lovers, and super excited to be a part of this discussion about Ghostlight here tonight.
Michael's been a friend of the pod. He's been on a bunch of our previous episodes. Off the top of my head, you were here to talk about, I think, Perfect Days together, Godzilla Minus One. There's a bunch more in there as well. But we are excited to have a little kind of mini series here in October where we are going to be reviewing and discussing films that have been recommended to us by friends of the pod. And so Ghostlight is one that I believe, Michael, you really loved and had recommended as one for us to watch. So we're excited to have you here to be able to talk about this movie with us. I think it'll be a really good time. Okay, Sarah, do you want to kick us off with an IMDb summary for Ghostlight?
When a construction worker unexpectedly joins a local theater's production of Romeo and Juliet, the drama on stage starts to mirror his own life.
A great premise. I remember actually, we were just chatting after one of our previous recording sessions, and Michael, you were raving about this movie and had shared a little of the premise with us, and we were so intrigued by this concept, this premise, and this storyline. So a pretty compelling premise, and the IMDb summary definitely nails it. Okay, well, in Movies in Us tradition, we often start off with our one-sentence summaries for the film. And as our guest, Michael, do you want to share your one-sentence summary for Ghostlight?
My one-sentence summary is, who knew that you could find therapy at community theater?
Yes. So much transformation and healing happens at this community theater. So good. Very good. Sarah, what is your one-sentence summary for Ghostlight?
Mine is Romeo and Juliet, bringing families together since 1597.
Nice. Together, maybe up for interpretation for how we want to think about what together might mean. So good. My one-sentence summary is, it's a family love story. Baby, just say yes.
Nice.
All right. Well, let's dive in. I am curious to hear all of y'all's thoughts about this film. In this first section, we will not spoil Ghostlight. We recommend checking it out before really listening to our spoiler section, but don't worry, we will not spoil this movie in this first section. We'll keep our thoughts at a high level for how we feel about this movie. Maybe, Michael, since this is a movie that you seem to really love and is near and dear to you, do you want to share a little bit about why this movie really stuck out to you and kind of left an imprint on you and was one that you really felt excited to be able to share?
I mentioned to y'all about how excited I was to see this film. It was a film that prior to a month or so before its release, I really didn't know that much about. I kind of had heard that it was at Sundance, and like a lot of films that get premiered at these film festivals, unless it's like a major film, you hear about it, but then you kind of lose track of it. And this is one of those films that it premiered at Sundance and then went under the radar, and then about a month out from when it was going to be released, that's when the trailers came for it. And I don't remember exactly if I was seeing it online or if I saw it in the theater before another indie film that I watched. But as soon as I saw the trailer, I was like, I have to go see this film because it just looked so interesting. The premise of it was interesting. It just really looked intriguing. And so I made sure to get my ticket in. The funny thing was that it was the same day as the Bike Riders, which I got to guest with y'all on for that episode. And so it was very apropos that I come back and do this episode with y'all as well, because I got to see both of those films on the same day. I saw Bike Riders first, and then I saw this film about a couple of hours apart. And sitting in the theater watching this film, I think I was the only person in the theater for this film.
Wow.
And
that's special.
Yeah.
And that
And
happens.
I remember just sitting there watching the film and just feeling like a roller coaster of emotions, because I feel like that's what this film does. It takes you on a roller coaster of emotions as you go along with this family. And I remember walking out of the theater and just was like emotionally just was wrecked. I get, for lack of a better term, because of just how it just made me feel. And it's definitely what I think it's one of the most underrated films of the year. And I can say with fair certainty that when December rolls around and I think about as a whole what is the most underrated film of the year is, I'm pretty sure this one's going to still be at the top of the list, because I feel like it's a film that nobody talks about, but it's a film that has so much emotion and so much themes that really resonate with people. And it's a film that I feel like more people should watch, even though the subject matter can be tough for some people. But I feel like it's a film that everybody can relate to in some capacity, whether directly or indirectly have been affected by the themes of this film. But just the general just thoughts of this film, I think, really are ones that people can resonate with and think through and feel through.
That's so good. It sounds like this film really like struck that emotional chord with you and felt really personal. And it's really exciting when a movie is able to do that and really move you deeply. So that's really, really neat. Sarah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about Ghostlight. What do you think about this film?
Yeah, this is one that I hadn't even heard of until, Michael, you told us about this film. I think you're right. This is such a good film, and it's kind of like surprising to me that more people aren't talking about it because it is so well made. And I really appreciate the way that the story is structured, and the film just drops us right into the action. And there's no exposition. We don't know anything about any of these people, and we just learn so much about them just by being immersed in their lives. And the way that the story kind of unfurls piece by piece and little bit by little bit. And there are a few different questions that we have throughout. And the film is so slow in answering those questions and is so methodical in the way that it unveils information. I found that to be really strategic. And then, it's just fun hanging out with these people who are doing community theater. And it was just great to be in that environment. So there are these really deep moments of sorrow and big emotions that people are grappling through. But then there are also these really sweet moments of connection and joy and just people having fun together. And there's just a lot in this film, which I was pretty surprised by. Like, I didn't expect it to be as funny as I found it to be. But yeah, I had a really fun time just kind of hanging out with this community theater troupe and just spending time with them as they're figuring out how to put on this production of Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, I want to plus one to a point you made, Sarah, around this movie being so unexpectedly funny. And I think it is such a great balance with how sweet and endearing and touching the human connection moments are in this film. I think this premise, this concept could easily have been really tugging on all of our heartstrings in a maybe more cheesy way, but I think this film is so balanced with that cutting humor and the spice and the pizzazz that these big colorful personalities have in the way that they spar with each other and challenge each other. And I think that balance really makes this movie shine. And if anything, it makes those really tender moments almost become more tender because it's against a backdrop of them just, sparring with each other and bantering right beforehand. All of the connections, the human connections between the characters in this movie feel so full and real and raw. And I think that's challenging to do well without the movie feeling maybe manipulative or melodramatic, especially covering such intense subject matter. And I was really impressed at the movie's ability to balance a lot of that. This movie reminds me a lot. I was thinking a lot about the film Coda, which is another film that like had me absolutely wrecked at the end of it. Just an absolute puddle of volunteers, but in the best way. And I think similarly, that movie also somehow strikes this really ripe balance between the tenderness of the film, but it's set against some of these sharper, spicier moments that is like the human experience, you know? And I think that's what's really impressive to me about this film. Obviously, there's a lot that we can talk about with the storyline and the characters and some of the filmmaking components, but on a whole, I just think it's hard to tackle a movie like this that is so, wears his heart on its sleeve, and to do it in a way that feels so real as well. That's a very difficult balance to do, and somehow this movie is able to do it.
I think part of the credit goes to the writer and the director and how she wrote and cast for this film. I don't know if you know the story about how the casting went about, but initially the writer and director, she wrote the film in the part of Dan, the father and husband, specifically for the guy that ended up playing Dan. And so she wrote out the role specifically for him. He got cast in it. And then as he got cast, he suggested his daughter, who is an actress and she's been in a couple other roles, and said, hey, she should play Daisy. And so she auditioned for the role, and then she got it. And then later on, her mother, his wife, got cast as Sharon. So the entire family is the family in this film. And I feel like that part of it really adds another level of realism to their performances, because they are an actual family in real life. And so to have that dynamic be a part of this film, I think really adds a level of realism to their performances, because, you know, they know each other so intimately and so well. And to see that be a part of how they play these roles, I think does a really good job of adding even more of another layer to the depth of their characters.
That's really fascinating, and it makes me think about a whole bit in this movie around like having an intimacy coordinator to help these two leads feel comfortable and selling that idea of being like star-crossed lovers. And it's almost like this family didn't have to do that. There's a sense of comfort and safety and intimacy that they already have that really translates well to the screen when they show up and are goofing off or bantering together. There's already so much there already that doesn't need to be sold to us. But you're so right, probably really helps sell this concept of this family that has been through so much, but also has so much care and love for each other that kind of shines through even when they are hostile towards each other or distant or aloof or disconnected. There's that base level feeling that we get of there's so much history here and there's so much connection here. Maybe it's not fully on display right now because they're going through a lot, but it is there and it's palpable. We are going to include a spoiler alert here for Ghostlight. So if you haven't watched this movie yet, we are about to dive into all of the aspects and plot points of this movie. So if you haven't seen it, make sure to watch it before listening to the rest of this episode. We are also wanting to include a content warning alert. So heads up, this film contains references to or depictions of suicide, which we also reference in our conversation. Please use care when continuing to listen to this review. So I'm intrigued. Perhaps there's a lot of themes and topics and ideas that this film is exploring and tackling. I'm curious for both of you, which were some of those themes that like really stood out to you or like stuck with you or maybe captivated your brain capacity as you were watching this movie or perhaps after the movie ended? Where did you find yourself ruminating on?
I think for me, it really depends on which viewing. When I saw it the first time, it was a lot of dealing with trauma and grief and how these characters either poorly dealt with grief or at least somewhat tried to deal with grief. I think that kind of was how I saw the film the first time, because when you watch the film for the first time, you don't really know exactly how the story is going to play out. I mean, you see how Dan and Daisy and Sharon are dealing with this trauma that they went through, and you don't know exactly at the beginning of the film what that is. You just kind of know something happened that wrecked their lives, and they are dealing with lawyers, and it's affecting Daisy at school, and it's affecting Dan at work. But you don't really know how or why that happened. And it was interesting that first watch, and just how they dealt with grief, how they dealt with trauma, how they dealt poorly with it, until you find out kind of the whole story of what happened to lead to that trauma, and then ultimately how they get the beginning stages of healing. In the second rewatch, knowing what the trauma was, it almost was a understanding of what it means to deal with someone who has a family member or friend who has committed suicide. And so seeing it from that perspective throughout the course of the film, seeing those moments at the beginning where Dan is looking out the back window and seeing that patch of grass where the trampoline was, where he saw Brian, his son, and his girlfriend, attempt suicide, and he passed away and the girlfriend didn't. And you see those moments there. In the first watch, you don't catch those. But in the second time seeing it, you really begin to understand like why they act the way they act throughout the course of the film. Really, that was kind of how I viewed that second watch, was how do these characters deal with someone who has committed suicide? Whereas in that first watch, it was more of just grief and trauma in general, that how they dealt with it poorly, and how throughout this course of the film and working with this community theater and finding a community where they could work out some of those issues that they were dealing with, particularly Daisy and Dan, and start to find some healing. Whereas, at the beginning of the film, there was no healing taking place. But yeah, that to me, out of those two watches, there were two different things that I picked up on, but they all kind of had that same little through line of how do we deal with grief? How do we deal with trauma? What are the healthy ways of dealing with it? And what are the unhealthy ways we deal with it?
That's so good. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating and interesting is that obviously there's this theme around the healing power of art. And you see the transformation that for both Daisy and Dan and Sharon, I would argue, like getting to be invested in this endeavor together with people and creating art together really opens up this like vulnerable side that perhaps they were denying or running from, because it's hard and it's difficult and it's painful to open up those spaces. But this medium has ushered in the ability for them to do that. But the other like fascinating aspect that I love that this movie includes is that point you mentioned, Michael, around this being a community theater. And you see so much, especially in the second half of the film, how much they need the people there. So yes, it's about the play and acting and becoming someone else for a while and tapping into your emotions. But I love that the movie doesn't just stay there, but also showcases how doing this with people, being known, being seen, letting people into your world, letting them love you through something that's this big and difficult is what we all really need as well. And so that community aspect and the relationships that all three of these family members form with this community theater group is just as much a part of their healing process in addition to the art. And so there's the healing power of art, but then there's the like 10x ability for art to heal when it's done together with people that I think we get to see so much. So those little shots of like Rita coming over after the performance to give Dan a hug and how much that just means. There's no words even spoken in that little moment, but you know that they all know what this meant. Seeing them like celebrate together after the performance is over, or when it gets hard, seeing them encourage each other. I loved how much we get to see the relationships and the community aspect of them going on this journey of transformation. And they're not really doing it alone. So it's not just the art, but also the community aspect.
Yeah, that was the piece that really stood out to me, was that theme of community and belonging. So like in high school and college, I was in choir, I was in musical theater, like I was in more of this world. And while watching this movie, I kept remembering people from like that time in my life that I honestly haven't thought of because it was so long ago and we haven't kept in touch. But it just made me think of, you know, like the misfits that, and I mean, I was probably one of them too, but like the misfits that found belonging in that community, and they're distinct people that they didn't fit in anywhere else. But as soon as they walked into that musical theater space, they belonged and they could bring their full selves to that space and be them without having any shame or fear or any of that. And I love that this movie was able to capture that, you know, like you were saying, Jen, it's not just this play and this performance. It's not about Romeo and Juliet, but it's about how this group of people, they have been able to come together and find belonging and create that safe space where they don't have to feel ashamed. You know, they can express their emotions. They can bring themselves to this, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I loved that this movie so effectively captured that sense of belonging that all of these people, they all need, but then they all bring to this space to create for one another.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is, you know, obviously there is the parallel and the reflection of the play Romeo and Juliet and what's actually going on in the lives of this family. Like we see that kind of played out through the course of the film, but it really is kind of the practices, the rehearsals that we see with this group where Dan really starts to have those breakthrough moments of being able to understand what Brian was going through, to understand what Daisy is going through, and to understand how to deal with his grief. One scene that really, I think, is kind of one of those turning points for him was the scene where they were gathered together and Dan and Lucian get called out by the stage director to do this act where they had to ask these provocative questions, and
Yes.
and it was like, you have to look directly at the person, you have to ask the question, and then how they respond, you have to say what kind of emotion that they're showing. And obviously they have the, you know, the really jokey kind of one that Lucian first throws, and then Dan just throws like the one about the Michael Jordan shirt. And then Lucian is then prompted to ask a deeper question, and Lucian asks Dan, "Are you lonely?" And the shock on Dan's face when he hears that question, because it's probably a question that he has not really wrestled with or thought about or anything since the passing of his son, it really rocked him and it really made him think. And I feel like it was kind of that turning point of starting to really understand where he's at, because obviously we see a lot of the other emotions that he has, particularly anger. That was one, is his way of handling issues, of just bottling things up and then erupting at the worst possible moments. But I feel like at that point right there is when he starts to understand that there are underlying themes of what he's dealing with and what he's going through that he hasn't addressed, that he hasn't worked through yet. And I feel like that being a part of that group, he gets to have that safe space to where he can work through those emotions, work through those things that he's dealing with. And then later when Daisy joins in the group, she gets to be a part of that as well, so that there is that space where they can wrestle with those emotions that they can't really do outside of that building.
And I love that it's this like dual track that he's going on, and as he is learning, as Dan is learning to be more empathetic and better understand what others are feeling externally, he is also able to better understand what he is feeling internally. And I love how this film captures that, because that's so true to real life. I think like the more that you learn how to empathize, the more then that you have that capacity and that, I guess, I don't know, you have the words to understand what you yourself are feeling too. And it's cool to see him making progress both internally and externally throughout this film, and I feel like that's not something that's often captured in movies, especially with a male protagonist. So it was just very cool to see how effectively you can see that progression and that growth in him throughout the film.
Yes, what I love about what follows after the provocative questions exercise scene is that right after that, he and Daisy go out and they're hitting baseballs at the batting cages, and she's laughing and she's carefree and a little bit more loose than she normally is. And he says this little line, "You're happy." And you're just like so proud of him, you know, like it seems so simple, but when you've gone through so much trauma and have been stewing in so much of your inner world for so long, just that little acknowledgement of him putting into practice this little muscle that he's been growing and developing through that provocative questions exercise of like seeing, identifying, and empathizing with the emotions of somebody else, and seeing him put that into practice with Daisy, I think was just like really neat to see. It's a small little moment that happens right after that provocative question scene, but I think it was really impactful to showcase like, yeah, he's really growing in these small, tiny ways and these little revelatory moments where he's realizing the emotions of the people around him and creating space to see them finally.
Yeah, and I think we see throughout the film, especially there are moments where Dan and Daisy in particular, how they deal with grief and deal with trauma, they're similar, but yet they're different. You know, we see with Daisy, especially early on, she's quick to fly off the handle. She's quick to yell, and she gets into the incident at school with the teacher in which she gets suspended. She goes out in front of the school and yells at the car that just stops right in front of her. She very much is a typical teenager in that she has, these emotions, but she also has this trauma of losing her brother, who she was close with. And then, like I said, mentioned with Dan, he bottles up his emotions until he violently erupts and screams and yells, and then gets into the incident with the guy in the car outside of his workplace. They both have terrible ways of dealing with trauma, but they do it in similar ways almost. Like they violently erupt, whereas Daisy just completely is violent and wild all the time, verbally. Dan is one that balls it up until he just erupts, and then it can get physical. And almost contrasting that with Sharon, the mom and the wife, who tries to deal with the emotions. We see that with the play that she does or helps put on at the beginning of the film with the little kids and the song, because if you notice what they're singing, they're talking about anger and how to deal with anger and the emotions of it. So like she understands like there needs to be some working out these emotions to, deal with this trauma. And she even, tries to do it through building a garden. She goes to the store and they're having an end of season sale, and she's going to, start a garden out in that area where the trampoline was and where Brian passed away. And, that's when we have probably, I think, the most scariest moment of Dan's eruptions, even more so than the guy in the car, was when he yells at Daisy and scares her because, he is still not at the point of dealing with the trauma and the grief of losing his son, that he, can't see anything else taking that space, even though Sharon is trying to move on. And, even at the end of the film, like, she talks about how she's tired and that she wants to grieve and wants to, deal with this, but Dan has not let her throughout all the course of what it had taken place. And so you see, like, through those three, how they all kind of deal with trauma and grief in a different way. And that, Daisy is almost like a chop off the old block in how she deals with it, similarly to Dan, and that Sharon is almost trying to play the middle of working between the two, dealing with Daisy and the outbursts that she does, dealing with Dan and how he shuts himself off until he just erupts. And it, in life, that's the same thing too. I have had, from personal experience, friends and others, acquaintances that have committed suicide, and I know the grief that has caused on my friends' families and what they struggle with, even to this day. Like, they still carry that hurt with them, even though, it's years and years have gone by. And if you don't deal with the grief in a proper way, we see the results in this film, especially early on, how it can be detrimental, and that, having that community to come alongside you and help with you to process those emotions in a healthy way, like with this community theater group and how they help Dan and Daisy to process those emotions and help them work through it in a more healthy way, other than just erupting at every moment or bottling up and then letting it explode.
And I love that there's so much nuance in this film. You see Daisy with her outbursts, and, like, she's so out of control, but it's also really hilarious. Like, I don't know if I should have been laughing, but I thought it was hilarious when, especially in the beginning, when she's standing in the street yelling at the car that's honking at her. Like, there are just these moments that are so funny, but you know that it's coming from this deep place of pain. And even with Dan, he does have these outbursts and these moments of violence, but you also see these moments of grief, and you see how he is isolated, and you see how much he is struggling. And so I love that there was so much nuance there, and none of these characters are just one thing. They're not stereotypical, or they're not two-dimensional, but you see how, like you said, Michael, a loved one committing suicide affects your entire life, and it just upends everything. And this film uses such care in showing that story, and I appreciated that, because it's such a difficult subject matter to tackle, and there's a lot of ways that this could have gone wrong, but you can just sense the care and just, like, the for lack of a better term, like, the affection and the tenderness that everyone had in this movie for handling such a delicate and difficult and sadly relatable storyline. I loved that. This was handled so well to make this story well-rounded and engaging and really, really heartfelt too.
I'm reminded of another film that, I was on with y'all in The Iron Claw, and how there was suicide in that story as well with some of the Von Erichs. And the director made sure to not sensationalize the deaths. And I feel like the director here did the same thing. She didn't sensationalize how Brian died. She didn't sensationalize, the girl who lived, his girlfriend, but we see the effects of it, and just seeing the effects of it in and of themselves is an emotional journey that the audience goes through and how to process it just as much as the family processes it in real time almost. And I think about the deposition scene when Dan is sitting there and he is asked by the defense attorney to go through the scene of what happened. And even the second time watching it and knowing what he's going to say, it just really just moved me. And it really struck a nerve of, all the things that he had went through, all the emotions that he went through. And, we got all to this point of, him working with the community group and having those processes of healing. But even with all that, when we get to that deposition scene and he's sitting there and he's reliving those moments of that night and then the next morning, how it just wrecked him. And I think that having that scene there really encapsulates, I think, for a lot of people, those emotions of, family members or friends that take their own life and how that, like I said, it just wrecks them and it hurts them. And they will always deal with that in some way, shape, or form. The pain and the loss will subside to an extent with time and healing, but there's always going to be that loss that's there. And I appreciate the fact that this story in this film gives hope and at the same time lets people know, yeah, it's still going to hurt. And yeah, there's still going to be pain, but there is hope on the other side of it. There is a new day. There's a new dawn that comes. And so I think that's one thing that I really appreciate, that it doesn't sensationalize death. I'm sure there's some that in Shakespeare's time would say that Romeo and Juliet sensationalized suicide. And I don't think that that's the case. I never have really taken that play to be something that sensationalizes it. And I feel like that this film is kind of the same way. I don't think this film sensationalizes that kind of death. I think that it really just helps people to understand whether they can relate to it and know someone that has gone through that, or even not, but just understand what it means to lose someone in a tragic manner. I think that is something that is relatable and understandable for anybody. And I think that this film does a good job of helping others to deal with that trauma and to deal with that loss.
And I think what's really powerful about that deposition scene at the end is that it really is the climax of the film. That is the moment where the journey of growth that we've been seeing for Dan really encounters a breakthrough, because his breakthrough actually isn't like healing the wounds. His breakthrough is like finally acknowledging and sitting in the space where those wounds exist and allowing himself permission to feel those difficult things without shutting down, blowing up, running away. And you see that he's been a part of this community theater and taking those little baby steps to empathize and understand and open up space for his own emotions, so that by the time we get to that deposition scene, we have seen him put in the time and the work, the heart work, to really be able to have sat in that seat and not gotten up and gone out the door. And so I love the parallel of that deposition scene in comparison to an earlier moment where I think Daisy and her counselor invite him in and they like try to talk about it, and he immediately shuts down and storms out of the room. And you would imagine that had he not put in all of those little baby steps along the way of that growth, he would have like stalked out of that deposition moment so quickly, and blown up in the ways and patterns that he always has. But the growth is him being able to just stay in that seat and to like look these people in the eye that he's villainized for so long or tried to pass blame to, and finally just sit there and have a really real, raw, but difficult human moment and not to run from it. And that is like, regardless of if you can relate to the exact scenario situation that he's in, or not, the reality and truth of like, as human beings, we all have experienced difficult, painful emotions and moments of trauma in our own ways. And all of the different forms that we try and run from them, avoid them, suppress them, work our way out from them, the courage it takes to sit there in those and look those difficult emotions in the face, I think is really admirable. And we get to see him do that. And it's inspiring to us. It was inspiring to me as the viewer to see him go through that journey. And I think this is a point that I forget which one of you mentioned earlier, but I really loved it, how we get to see the full spectrum of reactions to trauma from each of the three family members. So Sharon is kind of a doer. I really relate to Sharon. She's like, we're going to do the lawsuit. We're going to plant the garden. Like we're going to just distract ourselves by doing things so we don't have to face the emotions. Obviously Daisy is the one that like lashes out and has the outbursts, and she's dealing with the trauma in her own way. And then Dan is the suppressor. He's pretending it doesn't exist and kind of avoiding it. And we get to see them all go on this journey of sitting together in that really difficult space. And I think that's neat to see this film has something for anyone in their different, very specific ways that they deal with hard things.
Yeah. And I think one thing, as far as like how we see Dan get to that deposition scene, there's really two key moments, I feel like, in the film where he's able to have that breakthrough. The first one is kind of in the beginning of when he is a part of the troupe, and people talk about how, you know, obviously the ending of Romeo and Juliet, how they both end up dying, and he gets upset and saying, well, you can't have this. This can't be the way this ends. Like we got to change it. We got to do something different. And everyone is like, no, that's how it ends. That's how it's supposed to end. And he just gets all like flustered by it. And, you know, they have to explain it to him. And then he has the first moment of like opening up to them that, you know, he lost a son by suicide, and then having that collective coming together of the group to console him there. And then the second one being the rehearsal right before the deposition and the performance, when they're having that run through, and Daisy and Dan are sitting there, and Rita as well, like talking through, kind of like helping Dan to understand, like, you know, what's going on, because again, he doesn't understand why these two would kill themselves. And Daisy's kind of explaining to Dan how Brian and what Brian was thinking and feeling. It's like, that's how you understand what Romeo is going through, and how, you know, why he does what he does, because he feels trapped, feels like there's no way out. And for that, Dan is able to start to understand what Brian was going through and the emotions, and helping, you know, to understand in some small way what was happening, so that when we get to that deposition scene, he is able to like fully relate to everything that's going on. Whereas at the beginning of the film, he is completely and utterly devoid of understanding. It's, you know, I don't understand why this happened. All I know is that this girl, you know, did what she did, and now my son's dead, and, you know, puts all the blame on it, you know, pushes through this wrongful death suit that nobody else in the family wanted to have, but Dan. And yeah, it really is. You had to have those two scenes to get to the deposition scene for everything to kind of come together, not just for the performance and Dan being able to play Romeo, but really for Dan to be able to process what happened with Brian and start to heal in some small way than he had at the beginning of the film.
Which is why I think it's so genius that the film has, I believe, a scene somewhere on like the third of the movie mark, or maybe the halfway mark, where I think he initially plays the father of either Romeo or Juliet. I forget which one. I think it's Lord Capulet. Anyway, he plays the parent of one of the two star-crossed lovers that dies. And obviously it is emotional for him, but I think it's Lucian. or one of the other community theater group members suggests like maybe Dan should play Romeo, and that is the beginning of him truly empathizing versus just having to relive that pain and trauma again and again through the play. He actually is now put into the shoes of Brian, as Daisy points out later on in that really beautiful moment. But I love that the film starts us off with him just like purely reliving the pain, and there is no room for empathy or understanding yet because he's still going through all of the difficult emotions. And it's only when he's pushed to, and honestly kind of forced to, have to figure out how to empathize and try and play this role that he doesn't understand, that in the friction of that, that's where the growth happens. So I loved that ordering of how the movie gets us to that moment where he's kind of on the edge of growth. Will he choose to try and empathize, or will he continue to reject this out of anger and out of fear of even trying to understand what his son is going through because it's too difficult? So that little like progression I just thought was like pretty genius that the movie wove into the plot.
Yeah, I love how this film is kind of like puzzle pieced together, and it really does unfold so strategically because you learn little bits about these characters and you start to form kind of an opinion of them. And then with each subsequent scene, we get new information about them, which then shapes how we understand them to be. You know, our understanding of who they are is transformed as they continue on this journey. And I appreciate how strategic that was set up. You know, we have obviously this mystery around what is this lawsuit about, what happened to this family, and then we understand that, oh, something traumatic happened. We understand, oh, he had a son, but the son is dead now. Okay. Like I loved how that part unfolds. And then at the same time, it's also unfolding all of these little pieces of their emotional growth as well. So it's cool to see them walking through this process emotionally, this process relationally, and we have this mystery around the son and the deposition and all of that. And everything is unfolding at the same time, and everything kind of like feeds into the other. I was really impressed at the structure and the writing of this, because that's not easy to do what they did in this script, and it all just flows so well together.
Yeah, I agree. Like the way that it's structured, especially when you watch it a second time and you know kind of what's happening, I feel like that you're able to kind of really sit there in the emotions and wrestle with it. I feel like the first time you watch this film, you're on a roller coaster because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know which bend and turn is going to happen. And so you just are along for the ride and trying to figure things out of what's happening and where's this going and everything along with that. But I feel like the second time you watch it, when you understand what's happening, where everybody is, it really is almost a harder emotional journey, because you know what's going to happen, you know what's going to take place, and you really kind of have to wrestle with those emotions a lot more. So I think that's why even on a multiple viewing, I feel like this film can wreck you, because it has, those things that you really have to wrestle with. And like what these characters go through, what they're dealing with. Whereas in the first time you watch it, you really don't know what's going to happen. You kind of have an idea, and then there'll be a hard left or a hard right. And, new information will completely change things, and you're just kind of on your toes. But when you watch it a second, third, fourth time, you really kind of have to sit there in the emotions and think through, now, what are they dealing with? How would I deal with this if I was in this situation? And so I really feel like that this film does, like you said, Sarah, it really pieces everything together, as well as when you have the whole puzzle fully complete, you're able to sit there and think about it, and it sticks with you, and you are able to wrestle with it and think about it a lot more, even after the picture is completely completed, and you're able to think through those emotions, think through those thoughts, and really be able to process it.
Yeah, there's probably so many little moments or details that really like light up for you. Like the one that was that I'm thinking about as you were sharing that is when Sharon at the end of the film, and by this point we know a lot of what's happened, but I imagine the like impact and emotions of it would light up in that same way, where I think Sharon says to Daisy, like, please don't ever play a character that has to die again, you know, because you see the cuts to her feeling all of the emotions of watching her daughter die on stage after having gone through that experience, watching her son go through that. Just like the emotions hit. And I imagine that the second watch of this movie would have that same effect of like all these little things that seemingly would be fine to watch on a stage in a play, of watching your kid, you know, play this role in Shakespeare. But they just like, they hit in a different way because you now have the full picture of all of the context that has happened. So, man, I can imagine what you're saying, Michael, around this being like way more of a gut punch, perhaps on the second time around, because we know, we understand the context. So every little longer stare out through the window feels that much more weighty that might have just passed us by earlier. One of the characters that I would love to give a shout out to, because I was just so captivated by her in this movie, and I think she, in a lot of ways, is a center of gravity, but there's so much more of a story to her that I wish we would know. We don't need to know. The movie's not about her, but I'm just so intrigued by her as a human, is Rita. The way that Rita is able to pinpoint and see exactly what the people around her need in a given moment is like absolutely magical. In the earlier scenes when Rita's inviting him in and, you know, inviting him to join and do the table read with them, obviously we know that this story is going to be about him joining this group, but I'm just like, this man is so cranky, so disgruntled. Like, how is this woman going to work her magic to get him to come back again and stay? But she really like sees the people around her with such clarity, and her emotional intelligence is like through the roof. But we get to see that like really captivating effect that she has to know what people need and how to love them in the moment that they're in right now. So we get to see that obviously on full display with how she so tenderly guides and encourages Dan to come and join and open up. But I love how that's clarified when we see the way Rita interacts with Daisy in the second half of the film, and understanding that little bit of encouragement of getting this moment where Daisy gets to be on stage again after she's probably put that dream and that joy to rest after everything that has happened, how much she just needed that moment. And so I'm just so intrigued by Rita as a person. She obviously has such a story that we get little bits and pieces of, but I think she's so pivotal to this plot, and arguably you could say like really ushers in so much of that transformation for this whole family and the ripple effects of it.
Yeah, I love Rita. She's hilarious. Like, what really made me laugh, there were like, you know, like we mentioned how there are some really funny moments. One of the funniest moments is when she is interacting with the guy who was the previous Romeo, who wanted to have the intimacy coordinator and studied at ISU and all this, and was talking about, you know, all these different things. And, you know, she got upset at him. And at one part was like, you know, you're too old to play Juliet. You have to be young, and that people are impulsive. And then she ends up punching him. That's pretty impulsive to punch somebody out of the blue like that. And it just was just a funny little moment that, you know, she understands like what everyone's going through. Like initially, like when we first introduced to her, we don't think that, because, you know, she's just, you know, yells at Dan about how they're making too much noise outside working on the road, and we don't get introduced to the real Rita until later on when she invites him into the table read. But she really is kind of that bridge to the healing that takes place with this family. Really, I think the whole cast, I think, does a great job with that, especially Moira. Moira is probably my favorite of the group. Like, she is just so encouraging. She's so sweet and kind, and really is kind of, I think, the first of that outer group to accept Dan into the community and, encourages him. And that first line is the hardest one to get out, but it gets easier after that. And she was my favorite out of that outer group of the community theater. And so I wanted to make sure she got a shout out.
She was also my favorite too. So I was like, yes, I want to give a shout out to Moira. I love how she fits in with the group too. 'Cause like you guys were saying, Rita does have so much emotional intelligence, but so does Moira. And I almost see them as one is like covert and one is overt in how they do it. And it's just kind of cool to see how these two women interact with each other, but they also care for Dan and Daisy in different ways. And you see their ability to read the people around them and meet them where they're at. And it shows up differently because their personalities are so different. But I was so captivated by Moira, and anytime she was in frame, I was just like, "Ooh, what are you doing?" Because she has this like quiet, subtle nature about her, and yet her presence is so felt. And so she brought so much to the group. That whole group was so entertaining. They were so, like, I just wanted to hang out with them. But yeah, Moira was really, really great in this.
This really funny moment with her where I don't remember what exactly happens, but like someone storms off and like it's awkward and she's just like, drama. She just has these like little tiny moments where like you see her little sass come through and her spunk. It's really great. But yeah, that emotional intelligence shows up differently, and she is a lot more reserved, a lot more quiet, but she is there for the moments that matter. And we get to see the movie, the screenwriters give space to showcase that too, which I think is so intentional and so wise. So you have the one that is obviously like the center of gravity and the traditional way we think about what a leader looks like. They're charismatic. They are, working the room, but Moira is a leader as well. And she adds and sets the culture of this group just as much. Okay. Time is flying, y'all. I wonder if there's any other big things we wanted to mention with Ghostlight. I'm sure we could talk about this movie for hours, but any other big things we wanted to hit before we wrap?
There's two things. There's one that is pertaining to the film, and then there's one that's just a question I just wanted to ask y'all about. The one thing that, mentioned things that were funny in this film, and this one was unintentionally funny to me, was the scene where Dan had just come through like the first table read, and he goes home and he's talking with Daisy, and he asks Daisy about Romeo and Juliet, and Daisy kind of explains it a little bit. And Daisy at one point says, "Oh, there's a movie." And she mentions, it's old, but it's good. And, and then she pulls up on her computer the 1996 version by Baz Luhrmann that stars Leo DiCaprio and Claire Danes. And as soon as that shot comes up on that laptop, I laughed and I was like, oh, I feel old. Because I remember that film. I remember watching the film. I think we even watched it in school, in my high school, when we were talking about Romeo and Juliet. But I remember that scene and I just laughed and I was just like, oh, I feel old. Because when that's considered a classic, then that you've kind of just gotten to that old part. And then the other thing was, and Sarah, you kind of mentioned it a little bit with your background, but I was curious, do y'all have any experience with drama club, or were you in your senior class play in high school? Like kind of what y'all's background is kind of with theater, if you have that.
I was in theater mostly in middle school, but in high school, I did a bunch of stuff with like the orchestra and the band, and that feeling after a show, like this movie captured so perfectly, that like high that everyone's on and they're patting each other in the back and they're hugging, and you just feel like, oh my gosh, we did a thing and we did it together, and there's just this rush of connection and camaraderie like that, and y'all go and get like ice cream or like ice cream floats or whatnot afterwards. That feeling this movie captured so perfectly, and the like team dynamic of doing something together that you've like worked your asses off for months to do is something that I think the movie really captured. And it's echoing back to a point we made earlier around like camaraderie and community and whatnot. But yeah, I like felt that. I was like, man, I miss that. Like being an adult now, there's less moments and spaces perhaps, or you really have to look for them in like maybe intramural sports or whatnot to find those like team dynamics that were so much a part of our school years. But what about you two?
Yeah, I mentioned it a little bit, but yeah, I've always been like artsy fartsy band, choir, all of the things. I love musical theaters. I love musical theater. And a little detail that I loved is in Daisy's room, you see all of the playbills on her wall. And it just made me chuckle because I did that in high school too. I had all of the playbills of the shows that I had gone to on my walls because it was just such a memorable part of my life, and just things that I wanted to, I don't know, remember and just like hold with me. So it was cool to kind of experience some of those things again. And like you said, Jen, that high of after a performance and you just accomplished this thing and you're so exhausted, you're running on adrenaline, but there's kind of nothing like it. And so this film, I'm surprised at how much of a memory lane this felt like for me to walk down.
For me, I was a part of my senior class play, and I still remember like the emotions of everything we went through, the practices and then the performance. And we only had one performance, and so it was like everything was kind of wrapped up, kind of like how this one, everything was like riding on this one performance and doing it and everything, and how there were kind of mishaps, like with Dan trying to climb the fence and he falls over, and his coworker Mikey is like, "Are you all right?" And he gives like the thumbs up of like, "I'm okay." Remembering like when in my senior class play, it was Under the Big Top. That's what it was. And it was about this zany, wacky, rundown, circus that was about to close, and that you had all these different characters. Like you had a lion tamer who was afraid of lions. You had trapeze artists that were afraid of heights. You had a fortune teller that had a cloudy glass ball that couldn't read fortunes, and all these different things. And my character was Andy, the animal sanitation engineer, as he would call himself, but he was known as the pooper scooper. And he was the smartest person in the circus, but he was also the pooper scooper. And so just everything that we did as a group, and as far as getting that performance together, having that camaraderie that we went through, and even in the performance itself where we had a complete mess up in one act where there was a scene where a line got forgotten, which heavily impacted later in the play, and we had to come back around and kind of fix it in the end by ad-libbing a line or two. But we just were all so like wrapped up in it and doing it and being a part of it. And then afterwards we went over to the sponsor's house and we watched the VHS tape, because again, how old we are at this point. But we watched it and we just were celebrating with each other of just how we came together and did that. And so I loved how, like y'all mentioned, how they celebrated this act of coming together and putting on this play. And yeah, it wasn't perfect, and yeah, they rushed at the end to kind of get everything together and find the place to put it on, and and get all the sets up and then do the performance. But it's those moments of, camaraderie and community. Again, I feel like that's what this film highlights as being a place of healing, being a place of coming together, and having those moments in real life where, as we mentioned, like we have those friends and those moments where we've had that, and we still remember those moments, and they're cherished memories that we have.
So true. And even the little details of like seeing Mikey show up and support his friend, like everyone knows when they see, their loved ones in the audience or their friend group that showed up to just be there, even though like maybe it's not even that great, but like they're going nuts for you. That feeling and what that means to you as you like poured your heart and soul into something always like means the most. So even like that like coworker relationship that we don't really get to see the depths of, but you see how much that means to Dan, and that really tender moment of them embracing at the end and Mikey being really proud of him also just like warmed my little heart. So yeah, totally. Absolutely. We need people. We were made to be in community and to do things together with people. All of the hard stuff, like working through all of our stuff, but also getting to do these like creative, artistic endeavors together. It's just so meaningful.
And I loved that moment with Mikey coming to the performance and celebrating Dan too, because I mean these are dudes, like they're construction workers, they're tough guys, and that's like the stereotype. And yet there's no mockery, there's no making fun of Dan or giving him a hard time because he's Romeo in Romeo and Juliet. It is just full support that you see from Mikey. And I absolutely love that. I feel like this film breaks so many stereotypes. And I loved seeing that these men supporting each other and cheering each other on and genuinely like loving each other instead of, oh, you're in a play that's so silly or like whatever, but actually just being excited about his growth and his healing and him doing something vulnerable like this. It was just so cool to see. So way to go, Mikey. Way to be a good friend.
A sweet little cherry on top for that final climactic moment. So good. All right. Well, this was our review and discussion of Ghostlight. As we mentioned earlier, you can find it available to stream or rent or buy on multiple streaming platforms. We recommend checking it out. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Movies and Us, and a big thank you to you as well, Michael, for one, recommending and drawing our eyeballs to this movie. This wasn't on our radar at all, and only through talking to you and sharing our love for movies that we even discovered this gem of a film. So thank you for sharing that, and also just coming on and getting to talk about this movie with us together. It's really, really great.
Yeah, I really appreciate it again.
Of course. Where can people find more of you and your podcast and all of your stuff on the socials?
Yeah, so you can find the Screen Nerds podcast wherever you get your podcast. Just search out Screen Nerds podcast and check out all the episodes there. There's almost 275 reviews now, so moving on up, and so you can go back and listen to the archives. There's always new episodes posting pretty much weekly, and you can listen to them there. On the socials, on Twitter, you can find at Screen Nerds Pod, and then Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky, just Screen Nerds Podcast. And like I said, again, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's always fun to talk with y'all because y'all understand what it is to talk about and celebrate films and to really dig into them and to be a part of a community. And so I always enjoy talking with y'all and really appreciate it.
Yes, it's the best. We have our own little community here. It's so cool. It's really, really cool. So our name, Movies and Us, sums it up. We're all about movies and the powerful ways we can connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories. So everyone is welcome here, and we're so glad you spent time with us today. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune into your favorite shows. Drop us a rating and review, letting us know your thoughts about Ghostlight. You can connect with us on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok at moviesnestpod, or email us at moviesnestpod@gmail.com. This episode was edited by Melvin Benson from Cinematic Doctrine. Check out his show for more great movie conversations. We will be back next week to discuss the film Logan's Run. We hope you have an amazing week, and we'll chat again real soon.